is to review for the midterm examination. And so, I think I sent an email out to you over the weekend, Saturday afternoon, that's saying the study guide was ready. I updated it for our new book. I went through every chapter that we've had assigned in this class and said, yeah, you don't have to know about that. Don't worry about this. It's important stuff, but it's not going to show up on the midterm, so don't try to study that. And I've just narrowed it down to the things that I think, these are the things that you'll be blessed for having studied. This exam is not just because I got to have an exam in the class. There are some things that you'll be a better programmer for if you know, and these are things that you study to learn. And so those are the things that I've specified in the guide. So that's what I want you to study. It's where the exam will be based. I had a student pick a random number in the prior class between 1 and 23, and that student chose 17. So you're about to find out what question 17 is like on the exam. You'll know at least the answer to one of these questions. To do 17, I got to get some data on this. The data is a little bit different than this, but what the data actually are doesn't matter. So we just put some data here. And it goes down to row 7, column E. All right. So that is the data. So if we were to run this code, the question is, what will the result be when this code is executed? So if I say B3 range E3 dot current region dot address. And actually, if I assign that into, I think I assigned this into B1, so I'm going to say range B1 dot value equals. So the question is, when I run this line, what is it going to put into B1? What do you think? Anyone want to take a shot? Pretend it's the exam. What would you put? The good news is I'm going to give you some to choose from, so you don't have to come up with it on your own. You can actually pick one of the list. And I think I'm allowed to give you up to 10 choices on every question. On this one, I only gave you 9, so there's even one extra little thing. 9 things you could possibly choose. Any idea what that code is going to put into B1? Yep, go ahead. Yeah, skip the dollar sign. She's going to say B. I just say that. B3. So one option is that it's just going to put B3, the very address of this cell right here. So that's a possibility. In fact, that is option number A on the exam. Yep. So you're thinking it's going to be this whole set of contiguous data. Okay, that's another option. That is choice number H on the question. Yeah. You think maybe it'll be C4. That is not a choice. So let's run it and find out. And it puts in B2 to E7. So here's what I'm saying is that it'd be great if you knew that there's this thing called current region. It's a method, or maybe it's a property, of the range object that says, hey, from whatever cell I'm on, I want to refer to the set of contiguous data. So it's defined by which cells have data that touch each other. Right? So if I had just one little connection right down here, and then a whole other block, what's the current region now? That whole thing. Because it can kind of connect through this set of data right here, it connects that together. If that one's missing, and I do a control star selects the current region from when you're in Excel. Because there's a whole blank line separating this, these two ranges are now separate from each other. The current region says, just by what cells are touching data, how far can I go? Okay. So that's the freebie. There are 50 questions on the exam. If you want me to, I can read you 42 through 50. Shall I read these to you? Please evaluate how prepared you felt before taking the exam. A, prior to the test, I felt I had studied enough. B, prior to the test, I felt I had not studied enough. C, I didn't have any idea. So the last 9 of these questions are really just me getting a feeling for, did you think the test was fair? Did you think that there were trick questions? And I'm asking you this when? What's the timing for these questions? It's before you find out how you did on the test, right? You fill those out and then you'll turn it in. So I'd like to see, you probably won't feel as good about it after you get your score as you do before, so. So well, that's true. The last questions, and they're not even worth any points. So there are really only 41 questions that are worth points. I think there's 100. Oh, maybe I'm going to scale it. So there's 100 points on the exam right now. I think the midterm is set for 200 points. I may just, before I print this exam, I may double all the points on it. But anyway, the first 23 questions are questions where I give you just usually either one line of code or I just ask you a question, normal, multiple choice. The remainder are the ones like, I think I've given you that. I've given you the 2 kinds of questions on the study guide, so you've got a feeling for that. Folks, the rest of the class today, until an hour and 5 minutes from now, is you asking questions. And if you don't ask questions, I will dismiss class early. Don't tempt me, I'll do it. So, how many of you had a chance to look over the study guide at all so far? So it might not be a bad idea to bring that up and just kind of scan it. And if you see something you say, maybe I should know about that, we'll take a look at it. I'll even pause the recording.
How much of this is said that some of it
Yeah, so the question is, how much of this is going to be vocabulary? And by vocabulary, there's really not much that's vocabulary. Even that first question, I'm asking, not, here's a word, give me the definition, which I normally think of as vocabulary. But, I'm asking you, can you look at that and say, what font is? Is it a property? Is it a method? Or whatever. And so I guess part of that is vocabulary. But the first 23 questions are of that nature. And so, there's kind of a couple of questions like this too, where I say, here's some data. You've got to have a variable that stores, these 4 numbers. From the options I give you below, what's the best data type for those? And maybe it's, 1 through 10. What would be the best data type if the only values you ever had to store in the variable was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10? What's the best data type for that? Yeah, probably integer. Just numeric, it's going to be 2 bytes. If I do string, I'll have some overhead. I got to have 4 bytes of overhead plus the 1 or 2 characters. So they're all numeric. So it seems like integer is the right. Oh, did you say integer? No, sorry, not integer. Integer takes 2 bytes to store, and I can store those integers in less. What data type would do it for me? Single takes, take 2 or 4. I can't remember, but it's a floating point number. It takes more than I need as well. Byte, yeah. So there's an integer type called byte that can handle numbers, the ranges 0 through 255. And I think in the study guide, I've specified only 2 data types that I want you to know the range for. Byte is one of them, 0 to 255, and integer is the other. And I don't even really want you to, I don't need you to know the specific range for integer, just roughly. That's roughly plus or minus 32,000. So if I'm dealing with something that's 10,000, yeah, integer could handle it. If it's 100,000, integer is not going to handle it. I need to go to a different type. So, yeah, is that what you mean by vocabulary? Yeah, so that's vocabulary. And that's integer can go plus or minus 32,000. It's 32,767 to negative 32,768 or something like that. Question here and then here. Sure, let's take a look. So this is a question on methods, properties and methods, and let me go ahead and open up a module here, insert module. Sub properties and methods. Prop and method. Prop method. Okay, so first thing is that when we're programming in VBA, we're dealing with objects a lot. The range is an object, sheets are objects, charts are objects, the title of a chart is an object. Everything's objects. Objects have two characteristics that we're really keenly interested in. One is a method, which is like an instruction for the object to do something, and then one is a property, which is a characteristic of the object. And so if I had a line similar to this one on the study guide, which is this, sheet 1 dot range A1 dot font dot bold equals true. All right, so what is this? If I say sheet 1, what is that? And we're going to say range, and we're going to say, is it an object? Is it a property? Is it a method? Is it more than one of the above? Yeah, that's an object. It's just an object. Now how could you tell it was an object? Yeah, because it has a dot after it. You see the object, if you say some word, dot, and then it has something else after it, whatever is to the left of that has to be an object, for sure. Because objects are what have properties and methods, and when I say dot, I'm talking about a property or method over in this direction. So that's an object. So how about range A1? What do you think? Object, method, property, more than one? It's definitely an object. How can you tell it's an object? It's got a dot. It's got a dot after it, so it's got to be an object. But now here's the trick. It's also got a dot before it. If it's got a dot before it, not only is it an object, but it has to be either a property or a method. That's the syntax. Object dot property or method. So it evaluates to a method. It evaluates to an object for sure. Is it a method or is it a property getting there? And the answer to that is, I don't care and don't expect you to really know. So it's either a method or it's a property that's getting me to that object. That's fine. So the distinction whether that's an object or a method, whether it's a method or a property that does it, doesn't really matter. The big thing I want you to know here is that it evaluates to an object. So it could be that a method is executing and handing me back an object. It could just be that it's a property. What's the difference between a method and a property? Method's off executing something. Property is just a variable inside the object, just a value that's stored there. Okay, so how about font? Is it an object? Yeah, because it's got a dot after it. Is it either a property or a method? Yeah, happens to be a property, but I'm not going to ask you to be able to, I'm not going to expect you to distinguish in the middle of something whether it's property or method. Okay, bold. Is it an object? Not an object. There's no dot after it. I could give you a line, I won't on the test, where it ends with an object, but what keyword, if I had, if it was ending with an object here, oh yeah, Excel has this thing of this default property. I'm not going to do that to you. If you see something on the end, you're going to say, okay, that's a property. I'm assigning something to it. That's how you really tell this is a property. Oh yeah, so is it a property or a method? And yeah, if I'm assigning a value to it, you're going to look at that and go, that is a property. And so I'm taking this value true, plugging it into this, it's got to be a property. So what if it didn't have, what if it's just a line by itself? Say there was a property called activate. And well, first of all, you look at that and you go, that sounds like a verb. It's probably a method. That's probably a good heuristic for you. Sounds like a method. It's a verb, probably a method. But you can tell that this is a method. If this is a valid line of syntax by itself, how can I tell that's a method rather than a property? Yeah, I'm not. If it's a property, I either have to read the value out and do something with it, or I've got to put a value into that property. So here I'm putting a value into the property. I could print it or something, so I could do something with the value. But in this case, this is a statement by itself. And so the only thing that can be a statement by itself of property and method is a property, is a method, because the method is an instruction. And if it's just a property like dot value, and there's some value over here in the cell, can you imagine if I tried to execute this line? I'm telling the interpreter 7. What would you do if I walked up to you and said 7? It's not an instruction. And so a property by itself can't just stand on a line by itself. But a method can, because a method is an instruction. Okay, so that's a little bit on properties, methods, and objects. Did that answer the question? I forget what the question was. But okay, we'll go in the back, and we're starting to get some questions coming fast and furious. Oh, yeah. So we could, what if I had this? Range A1 equals true. Yeah, is that syntax valid syntax? Yeah, I hate the fact that this is valid syntax because it's actually inferring the value here. It has a default property. I'm not going to expect you to know any default properties. Yeah, so if you see something and you don't know what it is on the last here and it says equals something else, you're going to go, that's a property. I'm not gonna try to pull a fast one. Well, actually, it's an object and it's got a default property. Yep.
So you asked in the spreadsheet application that available. Phone is referring to the first question. What does phone refer to? And based on what you said, you asked about it's both an object or a property, object or a method.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to know that it's about property, method, or not.
Yeah, so am I going to ask you, is this, that's why I took that question off the exam and put it into the study guide, because I'm not going to expect you to know, is it a property or is it a method? So, yeah, probably should have amended the questions there as well. The only way that you could really tell, is this a property or a method, is to look it up. And this doesn't make you a better programmer to know, is it a property or a method? That's really just memorizing that particular word as being a property or a method. So ultimately, if that question had been on the exam, I would give full credit to either object and property or object and method. And I think, did I even say that sounds familiar now that I've said that? Yeah, either one would be full credit, because I wouldn't really expect you to be able to know that. You just have to memorize. It turns out it's a property, but the only way you'd do that is if you'd worked with it and known, okay, it's a property. It's interesting because there's most of the time when you go to, when someone online is talking about using this right here, they will refer to this as the range method. But if we look it up here in Excel, we put a dot right there. I'm sorry, we do sheet 1, we put the dot right here. And we come down to range. Is it a method or is it a property? It's a property. It's really strange to take a property and pass it a parameter, because that's something that property has to operate on to figure out what to return. And generally in object-oriented programming, properties don't execute code, they just get a value and pass it back. It's a variable inside the object. So even in a lot of really respected people who are writing great things about VBA, they think that they look at that, they think it's a method, and the distinction is very arbitrary. But if it's an instruction is doing something all by itself, it's got to be a method. That I expect you to know. Okay, there are. Yeah, so if we have this, we haven't used the activate method in class, but I would expect you to be able to look at that line. If I said, hey, what is activate, object, method, or property? I think you should look at that and say, that's got to be a method. And the reason you can do it is not because you've memorized activate, is because this is a whole line by itself. This is a line of executable code, and you can't do that with a property. Properties could never just be a line by themselves, but a method can be. Incidentally, while we're talking about lines of code, there is no line of code in this exam that if put into Excel would highlight red like this. So in no situation have I written a line of code that's just bad syntax. Now, there may be some questions here where I've given you some code and said, is this valid syntax? And you already know there's no line that's wrong, but there could be a missing line, right? If I had a for with no next, I would expect you to be able to look at that. If I'm asking you specifically, is this valid code, kind of look for structures like that. I'd expect you to know for's got to have a next. You'd say, no, it's not valid code. But you don't have to worry. You don't have to look at a line and say, that looks unfamiliar to me. Maybe it's bad syntax. I didn't do that to you on this exam. The very first time I made an exam for this class, I put as an option for every question where I'm asking to evaluate code, this can't execute because it's bad syntax. And the students wanted to hang me afterwards. And I realized that was really more than I should have expected them to be able to determine as beginning programmers. And so if you see a line of code written in this exam, that line of code, there's no error on that line. Okay? All right. Other questions? Yes. Methods with parentheses versus methods without parentheses. Sure. Okay. So in fact, we can do a method that can either work with parentheses or not with parentheses. So let's take a look at like adding a worksheet. So we've got a collection of worksheets. Here's all of our worksheets in the active workbook. Let's go ahead and extend this line out a bit. Workbooks. So here's a collection of all the open workbooks. I only have one, so I'll say the first workbook. Dot worksheets. This is now the collection of all my worksheets. And it has a method called add. So that is a method all by itself. And so I can execute that line. It'll add a worksheet. I've only got one sheet down here. When I execute that line, it should give me another worksheet. So I'll execute this line. And I think I will. Where's my... my two files. Too small. I'll execute it with F5. So that's giving me a sheet 2. My sheet 1 is still there somewhere. Sheet 1, sheet 2 is there. Now, it turns out that I can give an instruction to this. I can give some more feedback to this particular method. I mean, I can tell it how to behave. So I'll delete this sheet. I'll add a sheet again, but this time, and you notice that went before sheet 1, I'm going to tell it I want this to go after sheet 1. And sheet 1, the reason I can say sheet 1 that way is because the code name for this is sheet 1. So I could say sheets, sheet 1, or just sheet 1, but that's the name. Okay, so here I'm giving a parameter to the method to tell it not just how to add, but how, not just to add, but how to add. When you add that, put it in a particular place. And so now that should come in after my sheet 1 tab. And so sheet 1 is here. I'm just not quite getting enough to be able to see both of those here. Oh well. But it's here. Here's sheet 1, and sheet 3 came after it. Okay? Haven't got to the parentheses yet. So it turns out that some methods return a reference to an object. In this case, we just created a sheet. The method returns a reference to the sheet that it just created. In that case, not only do I want to add it, but I want to do something with the value that came back. So I might want to remember a reference to that particular sheet. So I will say dim s as a worksheet. And then I will say set s equal to this. But as soon as I'm going to do something with the return value of a method, if that method has any arguments, I have to supply parentheses around the argument list. The reason I have to put parentheses around an argument list is because it's possible to say I've got, say I've got some call to a method right here. I could say, I'll just do it in the immediate window here. Message box. message box will return a value. So let me print the results of this message box. I will put in here an argument. Hello. And then this second argument right here is really just going to be a number. So I could, put like VB critical. And VB critical has a value. So that's number 16. Here's the problem. Because I can nest a function inside the call to another function, I could come right in here, and instead of actually having that typed in, I could ask the user what they wanted to show here with an input box. And here I could say, enter a number. But now, because the input box has these other optional properties, or other optional parameters, and the message box has other optional parameters, you see that if I didn't have parentheses around this, if I had a comma here, it wouldn't know, does this next argument here belong to input box or message box? And so that's where these parentheses come from. So the parentheses say, if I'm going to nest a call to a function inside the call to another function or subprocedure, I got to know where the parameters for one stop and where they start for the other one. And so I should be able to execute this, and we'll say, okay, enter a number. I enter the 16, and then it puts that up with the red X. If I entered a different number, it would put up something different. 8. I don't even know what 8's going to do. Doesn't do anything, but the X is gone. And so the whole reason I have to put parentheses is that anytime I'm going to do something with the return value of the function, I've got to put the arguments in parentheses. If I'm not doing anything with the return value, I don't need to put the parentheses there. And if there's more than one argument, I can't put the parentheses there. Folks, this is really confusing. In the versions of Visual Basic that were created after Visual Basic for applications, they just said, just put parentheses all the time. That would be so much easier for us if that's how they did this, but they didn't. So anyway, so that's why, what is that? Oh, jerks, is that what someone said? Oh, jerks. So that's why we have to put the parentheses. Does that answer the question? Yeah. And it's exactly the same whether it's on the use of a method or whether it's on just these functions that are built in as a part of the VBA language. In the back. So the question is, what's an object class? And the answer is, when an object is first invented, when someone says, we need a new object, we'd like to have objects floating around here that do something great. What the programmer creates is he creates the class. Now, the only class that we've used in this course that has been a class built in VBA is the agent class, when we're using it to go get information from the internet. But we've used lots of other objects, and there were classes of those objects too, but they were created by someone. They're not created in VBA, they're probably created in C, and they're a part of the language. So an object class is the description of an object. So when I create an instance of an object class, I'm creating an object. So if I were to come here and say I want to dim C as a collection, collection is an object class, and then I will say set C equal to a new collection. So this syntax says, look at this class and actually make one of those objects. And so an object is an instance of the class, but the class is the description of what that object is. The class says, these are what all the methods are. These are what the properties are. This is how those methods and properties work. That's what the class is. And an object is an instance of the class. Let me get the code in place, and then I'm going to listen to your question again. So if I think I understood just what you're saying, you want to add something here like hello, Nephi, and Lemuel. And then you're saying we want to have another collection called D, set D equal to C. Okay, so the question is, what's going on here? It'll probably make sense for us to look at this in Paint. Here's memory. So when I say dim A or dim C as collection, I am giving myself a little tiny piece of memory here. It's just enough to hold a reference to another object. And I'm going to give this the nickname C. Okay, then when I said I want to create the object, I want to set C equal to a new collection, then that collection gets created. And that collection is an object. It's more complex than just a variable. So I'm just going to show it here as having multiple properties. And it has at least a count, and it's got a few other properties. So when I say set C equal to new collection, this new collection gets created, but then we put, this is located somewhere in memory, we put the address of that over here in this variable that was created. Functionally, what that does is it says this variable is going to just refer to this newly created object. So that's what happens by the time we've said set C equal to new collection. So inside this collection, we're getting references to these other strings. You could think of it as this way: hello. That's now in here. Nephi, Lemuel. So that's what these lines are doing. Let me finish off what this is happening here, and then I'll handle that question. So now, when I come here and say set C equal to D, or set D equal to C, I've got this other variable here called D, and I am saying, look, C has a reference to an object in it. I want D to refer to that exact same object. And so set C equal to D. I still have only one collection, but I now have two different object variables that are referring to that direction, that collection, or pointing to that collection. Now, the next question was, well, what if I skipped this line right here? Well, first of all, let's make sure that this one works, okay? I'm not going to see it do anything, but we want to make sure it runs without any error. No error, just executed it. So now what happens if we get rid of this line? So now I have dimmed C as a collection, and now I'm trying to add something to it. In this case, I have not ever created the collection, and so there's no place for me to add something to C. All C is a memory address. And so this should now fail, and it should fail right here on this line, because there's no add method instantiated. I mean, there's no object that's got the add method for me to call here. So when I run this, object variable not set, and it says C is just a memory address. I can't add anything to it, just an address. Whew. Okay, so here's the question. What if I said now, after I've done this, what if we said, let's delete one of these, C.remove. I give it the index number I want to remove, 1, 2, 3. Let's remove number 2. And then we'll do a debug.print of D sub 2. So because there's only one array here, what should happen, or there's only one collection here, when I remove number 2, that one will be gone. Lemuel will come down into the number 2 position, or come up into the number 2 position, however you want to think of it. And since D is pointing at the same object, I'm going to remove number 2, and that should I'll print number 2 before I delete from D. That should print Lemuel. Sorry, should print Nephi. I'll remove number 2. It should shift Lemuel down to the number 2 slot, and then print Lemuel. Should we run it and see if that's what it does? I hope it does that. We'll stop. I need a little more space up here. Stop that and run it. Oh, so I have an error down here below, but you can see that it did. It printed what was in the 2 spot Nephi. We deleted Nephi with this one. Even though we deleted it from C, D shows the effect because those are 2 object variables pointing at the same object. The question is, you can't assign an object to a variable, you have to reference it, and the answer is, we still call it assigning, but it really is, it's a separate thing. The object is somewhere in memory, and the only thing that we have in the variable is the memory address of where that is. So the question is, if I said x is equal to y, and these are just primitive data types, and I would be copying the value from one to the other, and if I changed one, it wouldn't have any effect on the other. It turns out, we haven't seen how to do it in this class yet, it is possible to get 2 nicknames referring to the same slot in memory. So that's possible, we haven't seen how to do it. I think we may do that by the end of the class, we may not. It's an unusual situation. Okay, other questions? Yes? The for each loop. So yeah, let's take a look at for each. In fact, we've got the collection here. Let's just go ahead and use this collection for it. So I'll declare a control variable here. I'll call it entry as a variant. I'll have these 3 values inside this collection. Then I will say for each entry in C. Debug.print entry. So this collection has 3 items in it. Entry is just going to be a variant type. It can behave any way. And so it's going to behave like an object here, and it's just going to refer to each one of these cells individually. Or not one of these cells, each one of these entries in the collection individually. So this should execute 3 times, and it should print hello Nephi Lemuel. Let me put a divider in here because we got other stuff that's printing afterwards. So I'll put that divider in so when I get to these other prints over here, I won't be confused with what they are. So I should see 3 printed above that line. Let's see his new collection, add those in for each entry in C, debug.print entry. That should have printed. I wonder why it didn't. Oh, it's because of the error. Okay, so we got all those 3 printed off, and so that's the whole idea for a for each loop. I've got some collection. It could be a collection of worksheets. It could be a collection of workbooks. In this case, it's just a collection of strings. And I'm saying, I don't know how many there are. I don't care how many there are, but I want to do something to every single item in that collection. And that's what the for each loop is used for. So how many worksheets do I have? Looks like there's at least 3 worksheets here. So if I had this, instead of working with a C collection, I could say worksheets or just sheets. In this case now, entry is going to be a worksheet. I can't just print the worksheet, but I can print the worksheet's name. So entry is going to refer to each one of these sheets individually through the code. And so now that should print the names of worksheets up here in the window. 1, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. So for each loop just says, I've got a collection with a bunch of objects in it. I want to iterate across each one. It takes a control variable that will get connected onto those objects, and that's how it works. Other questions on the for each loop? The question is it always entry? And the answer is no, that's arbitrary. So whatever I want to call this control variable, I could call it Fred. As long as it's a valid identifier in VBA, then it will execute. Yep.
You have to say where just
For each Fred. So not even syntactically correct. So because what happens is that what Fred is going to do is Fred is just it's just a variable that's going to connect on to the objects in a collection. I've got to say in, and I've got to have some collection here to work. Actually, it works with elements of an array too. We haven't seen that, but I could have a bunch of elements in an array for each Fred in, and then an array name, and that would iterate across the whole array.
you say sheets.
So sheets is all of the sheets in the active workbook. I could say this workbook. So this workbook is just a shortcut to the workbook that holds the code. That workbook has a collection called sheets, and that's all the worksheets and all the chart sheets that are on the sheet. If I had chart sheets and I wanted to skip them, just wanted this to apply to worksheets, I would just say, worksheet. That's just a collection of worksheets. It's a different collection. Got it? Okay, other questions? Yes. Sure, the question is, can I cover some of the debugging tools? The first ones that we should take a look at, before I talk about the debugging tools, let's talk about how to handle a runtime bug, a runtime error. This is one of the topics that generally falls in the area of debugging. So let's do some kind of example with a runtime error. So it turns out that it's possible just to delete a file this way. I could say kill and then give it a file name, c:\password.txt. If that file existed, it would just delete it. But because it doesn't exist, and I try to execute it, I get this runtime error number 53. So you're trying to, that file doesn't exist. You can't delete it, it doesn't exist. Well, the whole thing I'm trying to do is make it not exist. So if I get an error number 53 when I execute this, I should be okay with that. Just keep on going. And so here I'm going to bring that code down here, and I just want to make sure this thing doesn't exist. So I will say, go ahead and try to do it, but if there's an error, keep on moving. On error, resume next. On error, go to 0. On error, resume next says, hey, from here until the end of the procedure, if you get to a line that can't execute, no problem. Must not have been very important anyway. Skip it and move on. This is a dangerous thing to do. And that's why I want to isolate this error trap that I'm creating just around the line that I think might be problematic. The way I tell the interpreter, go back to your normal error handling, stop the code and show me the error, is by saying on error, go to 0. And so now, let me execute this without the error handlers on it, and that should give me an error. Error number 53, there's no file. But with these error handlers in place, when I run this, I'm not alerted to any error at all. It still can't delete the file, but it says, you know what, that's okay. If I wanted to be more sophisticated about it, I could say, I just want to skip it as long as it's error number 53 or error number 0. What's error number 0? Error number 0 is no error at all. So I'll try to execute that line, and then I'll say, listen, if the number of the error is different from 0, is greater than or less than 0, and the error's number is different from 53, either of those two outcomes I'm okay with. But if it's anything else, I probably ought to go ahead and let the user know. Message box, there was an error. Sounds like I write the error messages for Microsoft, doesn't it? Here's your message, there was an error, thank you. Maybe I will go ahead and tell them what the description was. And so now, if it was some other error, I don't know what other error it could be. I have no idea what else could possibly go wrong. Maybe if the file were locked by some other process, it would have a different error number, in which case it would have that error. I'll simulate that by changing this from 53 to 52. So now it'll be a different, it'll just, I'm anticipating 52 instead of 53. Now when I run this, it does come up and says, hey, there was an error, file not found. So that's building an error trap, yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what's the difference between on error resume next and on error go to 0? On error resume next says, hey, when there's an error, just keep right on moving. Just resume execution of the code. Where do we want to resume? On the very next line. So that's where the wording comes from. If there's an error, just move to the next line and keep on going. On error go to 0, the origin of this term is really weird. It turns out that back in the very early days of BASIC, you had to number your lines. And you would actually type in 1 and then put your line. This is now line 2 and put the line 3 and put the line 4. And if you wanted to say, you know what, right down here in my code, I'd like to go back to line 2. It was a great line. Go back there and just keep executing from there. You could say go to line 2. And you would go there. It was a hideous thing to do. What happens if you want to put a line between line 1 and line 2? You had to renumber all your lines. And it was a nightmare. It was a really terrible language. But the very first legal line number is line number 1. There is no line 0. And so when I'm telling it on error go to 0, you're telling it to do an impossible thing. And it can't do that. And so it just behaves as it normally would with an error. It's a weird. Couldn't they have done that better? They could have. They should have. But they didn't. That's the way it is. We got to live with it. Oh, well, the question is, if that makes it behave the way it normally would, why even do it? And the answer is, because I have other code down here. File, let's see, open C:\\some file .txt for input as number 1, close number 1. The point is, if I have some other runtime error after I said on error resume next that I'm not anticipating, I'm anticipating this to throw an error, and I am going to deal with it. Now I'm saying that's the only error I was expecting. Turn the error handler back on, because if in the code down here there's an error, I'm not anticipating it. See, without doing this, this on error resume next is in effect until the end sub. And any other line that might have caused a runtime error, I would just skip it and move on. And I'm saying I'm not prepared to live with that kind of risk. If there's an error after this, I haven't anticipated it, you better stop and show me what the error is. So that's why we put this here. Yes? The question is, when I'm opening the file, can I describe what number 1 does? And the answer is yes. Back in the early days of programming, before we had object-oriented programming. So when BASIC was first written, there was no objects. I couldn't say, open up a new file and have an object that refers to that file with methods and properties. I needed some way, if I had 2 or 3 files open, I needed some way to tell them apart. I might open up 3 files, read data from 2 files and write them out to the 3rd file. I got to keep them straight somehow, and that's how I keep them straight. So I could open up that one for input. I could open up another one for output. Some other file for output as number 2. And then I could do some reading from one file and do some writing to the other file. And this number then is how I keep track of which of those 2 files I'm talking about. So I would do some information that's moving data from one file to the other here. And that's what it's for. Okay, other questions? Yes. Question is, can I talk about the split function? Yeah, the split function gets us into the area of arrays. So let's have a couple of array examples here. Sub array1 or ARR Y, array 1, era 1. Okay, so let me dim names as an array, a variable length, let's see, a dynamic array of strings. Will this work? I'm not sure I can do it with a string. Let's find out. I could for sure do this with variant, but let me see if I can do it with a string. Now I could say names is equal to split, and then I could have several values in here. Nephi, Lehi, Sariah. You spell Sariah, S-A-R-I-A-H. Lemuel, Layman, Sam. I hope Layman is not too upset that I spelled his name with a lowercase l. First of all, let's just see if that line executes. Wrong number of arguments. Oh, split. Oh, sorry, this needs to be one long string. Yes, sorry, split is one string. In this case, separated by commas. And I'm not going to put spaces in there either. It's just going to be a comma. And then I'm going to give it a delimiter. So the first argument is a string that I want to split. The second one is what I want to split it on. So what split says, it says take this string, make it into an array. What's the array? I mean, how do I know how to cut it up? Well, just cut it up on every comma. And so now I should be able to say, we'll use a for each loop here as well. Dim x as a variant for each x in names, debug.print x. The point is it's converted this string into an array, so I can now treat it like an array. And those are now individual values in the array. Oops, starting up here. Yeah, so the question is, I mean, is this really a normal old array, just like any old array, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4? Absolutely. So instead of this, let's make x, we use it as a variant. Let's do for x equals 0 to the upper boundary of names. Debug.print names sub x. And let's go ahead and print x so we can see what it is. So first time through this loop, x should be 0, it should print a 0, and then it should put the name at the number 0 position. It'll be pretty similar to what it's doing here, except now it's going to print the number as well. So those really are in those locations, in each of those individual slots of the array. They each have an index number, and it really does just take a string, convert it into an array, and allows me to assign it to it. So if I've created a dynamic array, I can then bind that onto the result of the split function. That's split. There's an analogous one called join that will join them back together. It seems like I've never actually used. I always want to split things. I don't ever really want to join them, but let's see if we can remember how to do it. Debug.print join. I give it an array, names. I give it a delimiter. Instead of commas, why don't we delimit it with a pipe character? And so now that should print it back out as one string, but instead of being comma separated, it'll now be pipe separated. And there's that string rejoined back together into that array rejoined back together as a single string. Yep. Oh, sure. Yeah, so let's go ahead and put this in as comma space for all these. I'll leave that as just a comma on the end and change my delimiter to comma space. And now that I should end up, since there's no comma space, this should come in as a single entry. So Layman and Sam is now as one entry. we replace those with pipes, except for this one, which is still a comma. Okay, other questions? I really will dismiss this class early. Don't tempt me. Going once? Oh no, there we go. Yeah, with, end with. So with and end with, it's a really, it's a handy structure. I don't like it so much because it's one extra level of complexity that I'd rather not deal with when I'm just beginning, teaching just the beginning of this stuff. But let's see how it works. With, end with. The whole idea is if I want to change multiple properties of a single object, I want to do a lot of manipulation to one object, then instead of having to identify that object each time, especially if it's something long like this, let's take a look. Workbooks, sub 1, worksheets, sub 1, dot range, CB3. I want to change several things. I want to change the value of it equals conference or just conf. And I want to change whether it's the boldness of it. And I want to change the font name of it. What's the font name? Arial. And I can change. I want to change a lot of things about it. So instead of having this all spelled out like this, I can see that everything is the same on all these lines up to here. So what I'll say is, with this object, end with, just do that. Now, inside my with and end with block, anything that starts with a dot, I'm just telling the interpreter, yeah, I don't want to type it again. Just attach this onto the front of it. And so it does a couple of things. One, it makes your lines narrower so they're not bleeding off the edge. It does add a couple of extra lines in there. But depending on what it actually has to do to find this, it could be pretty processor intensive. It says you only have to execute that part once. It will remember that's the object and do all this stuff to it. So there actually is a performance reason to do this, even though I often don't do it. That's the reason. Yep. Yeah. So let's take a look at a two-dimensional array. So if I was to come in here and say dim some array, I'll just call it array. I'll call it employee array, EMPARR. And let's say I've got a bunch of employees in a bunch of different regions. So I will say, give me on one dimension I want 0 through 10, and on the next dimension I want 0 through 3 as string. So now I've just created, in fact, how many variables have I just created? This. The temptation is to say 30. But remember, the lower boundary on these is going to be what? 0. So my first dimension has how many different values? 11. And my second has 4, so it's going to be 44 different values that are 44 different variables created here. So emp r sub 0, 0, and I'm going to put an employee's name here. And so the name is going to be equal to Nephi. And let's say that for these three, what I'm doing with these 4 values is like kind of the full name. So here, this first column will tell me which employee I'm talking about, and then the first dimension is which employee. The second dimension is different parts of their name. So I want Nephi J one, let's do Nephi J Lehyson Senior. I don't know. So I've just filled in 4 slots of that array with those 4 values. If I wanted to do the next employee, Lemuel R. Lehyson Jr. I don't know. So that just writes over the same one. So here I'd have to say now I'm talking about the next set like this. Yeah?
So what is it around or singular?
Well, the question is, these are 44 arrays. Why not just do 1 through 44 and then just kind of keep track of the first 4 are the names of the first employee, the next 4 are the names of the next employee. And it's just a matter of saying, you know what, I can just think about this first one as saying this first number tells me which employee it is. The second number tells me which part it is. Yeah, so I could look at it and say, I'm looking at, you know, when if it says over here 9, 3, well, I know I'm talking about the suffix of someone, and then 9 is going to be a particular employee. Just in this case, that's all it really helps to do. Now, it turns out all the time that we've looked at declaring arrays, we've only ever specified the lower boundary. We've changed that lower boundary by saying, you know, something like option base 1, which says, yeah, when I declare array, start at 1 instead of at 0. But I can do that on an array by array basis by coming here and saying, I want this to be 1, 2, 3. I want this to be, 1 to 10 and 1 to 3. So I can actually specify the lower boundary right in here by using the keyword 2. And the lower boundary is not limited to 1. I can start the lower boundary at 5. Seems like a weird thing to do. And I never ever get the urge to do it. But the syntax is valid. In this case, this will now if I try to execute this, it's going to fail because it's going to say there's no there is no slot 0. So if I change all these to 5s and 6s, then it would execute again. Oh, this is 1 to 3, so I'm in trouble here. Let me change this one back to 0. And that should execute okay. So that's 2-dimensional arrays. Other questions? Yep. So typically on this exam, the average comes in at about the mid-70s. 70, sometimes as low as 72, 76, somewhere in there. So in the past I haven't given you as specific as a study guide as I've given you here. So, you know, but this is an exam you want to take seriously. You need to spend some time studying for this. Question?
Yeah, how would you suggest
So the question is, how should we, what's a good strategy to study for this test? And what I would say is the thing that you want to do is you want to look at this, you want to look at that study guide. And you know, if you're looking at something in the book that's not included in the study guide and you go, this is pretty important stuff, you're going to say, you know what? Don't spend your time on it. How I made the exam was I went through the study guide and I said, all right, here's this little thing right here. I said, be familiar with data types listed in 6.1. All right, how am I going to test if they were familiar with that? Write a question that try to test that particular one. And so is there a question for every single little point here? Maybe not one-to-one correspondence, because some of these I might have looked at and went, it's too hard to write a question for. I'm not going to try to write a question for that one. But yeah, if I were studying for this, I would take the study guide and I would study those parts in the book. and might get a buddy and say, you know what, why don't you go ahead and let's write some code for each other that tries to test some of these things, and then make sure you can follow through it. So being able to read that code, like this code block on the second question I've given you here, you want some practice doing that. It's not quite half of the exam. It's probably more than half of the exam in points, not half in terms of the number of questions. But you're going to have to go through that, be able to say, all right, here's a variable. How does this line change that variable? What's going on with it? Yep. Yeah, so a static array is one that we create by specifying. The question is the difference between static and dynamic arrays. Static arrays are defined, we define their size when we declare them. Dynamic array is where we declare it without specifying the size. And then later on, we give it its size. In this case, we gave it its size by the result of a split function. But we can give it its size expressly with the redim statement. So we can come in here and say, redim, my name's array, and I give it a new size. I want to have 20 slots in it. Okay, so this is going to split. This is going to put something in the number one array. We're going to print them off. In fact, let's go ahead and print them all off again. So here we're going to get the values for the names array. We're going to scroll all those off. We're going to redim it, and then we're going to a new size. So this is going to have like 4 or 5. I don't know how many it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different values, 0 through 4. This is going to have 20. It'll scroll them off again. Let's take a look at what it does. So here it's filled up that array. It's given me 0 through 4. Those are the values. Now it's giving me 0, 1, 2, 3. When I redimmed that array, what happened to all the names that were in it? They got erased. When I redim array, it makes a brand new array somewhere else in memory, and it says whatever array you used to be, gone. Poof. Well, what if I want to hold those values around? Is there any way to do it? Yes. You can put the keyword right here, preserve. And now it'll do the same thing. It says the old array is here, redim, make a new array somewhere else, and then copy the values from the old array into the new array. And so now it should print off the original ones plus leave them in there when it gets to the second running through the array. And of course, there are 20 values now. The upper boundary is 20, so there's 21 values. So the ones that are blank that are above it. So dynamic arrays just mean, hey, we can change the size after we start running. It doesn't start off with a size, but I can set the size later. And I can keep changing it. Yeah?
So, let's say you had 20 names.
So what happens if there's, what if there's more? I'll simulate that by redimming this down to 2. Right? So the point is, I'm making it smaller than it was before. And I'm trying to preserve. What's going to happen in this case is it's going to execute without any error. I'm going to lose all the values above that number 2 index. It's going to keep the ones it can keep, but if there's not room to keep them, it says, sorry, you're out of luck. Whew. Other questions? Yep. Yes. Okay, so the question is, hey, we're kind of getting used to this whole IntelliSense help here, So if I say I want us to do a message box, hit the space bar, it tells me, hey, here's your choices. Yeah, are you going to need to know this? And the answer is no. I'm not going to have you write any code. The test is 100% multiple choice. And so you'll need to be able to look at code and understand it, but you're not going to need to know, gosh, which order do these arguments go in? You won't need to know that at all. Is that really true? I really think that's true. Okay, hold on a second. That's not entirely true.
So like even just like row versus column.
Yeah, you should know that. Row is first. Always row column. Something you should know. Okay, there are some string functions that I told you to know about. You're going to need to know the arguments for those. So let's take a look at, I think I told you, I want you to know left and mid. Did I list them out specifically? Yeah, chapter 9. Be familiar with left, right, and mid functions. Be familiar with trim and length and replace. So for those functions where I specifically said these are functions you should be familiar with, you probably should know which arguments go where for those. I cannot think of any other example in that. But here where I specifically said I want you familiar with these, yeah, these are some that you use so often that I'm thinking these are ones I want you to be comfortable enough you don't have to rely on the IntelliSense to give it to you. I think that should do it for you. If there are no more questions, I really will dismiss the class early, even though it's only by like 5 seconds early at this point. All right. Oh, wait, sorry, one more question. I'm dismissing. Oh, the question is, can you bring any notes? No, it's closed note, closed book. Take in a brain, a pencil. You can take scratch paper, and I recommend scratch paper because it might be really helpful to say, you're looking at a code like this, to say, all right, there's a variable. Let me make, range 1 is right here. How does this line change this? How does this line change this? You're welcome to take a calculator if you want. There's some math because it'll say like add 10 to this, but the math's all pretty simple. The arithmetic's all pretty simple. All right, folks, thanks for coming. I'll post the video. Class dismissed.